The night was soft with the hum of distant rain, and the city seemed to hold its breath as he led her through the candlelit garden behind their favorite restaurant. Every step felt suspended in something unreal. The way the air shimmered with quiet promise, the way his hand trembled slightly in hers. Emma believed this was the moment she'd remember forever, when life finally felt simple, certain, and pure. Ryan smiled. That practiced, perfect smile, his eyes searching hers as if to memorize every flicker of innocence before it was gone. He dropped to one knee, and for a fleeting instant, everything, the candles, the scent of roses, the silver glint of the ring, blurred into a single heartbeat. She said yes before he could finish the question. Around them, the world erupted in warmth and applause, but beneath his joy, something cold stirred. Hidden behind the glow of love was the faint shadow of a memory he'd buried too deep, one that would soon claw its way to the surface. Morning light seeped through thin curtains, brushing against the remnants of celebration scattered across the kitchen counter. A half-eaten cake, empty champagne flutes, and a ring glinting faintly in the sun. Emma moved quietly, humming to herself, lost in that sweet afterglow of a dream realized. Ryan watched her from the doorway, the calm weight of his smile hiding the turmoil beneath. The night before had been perfect. Too perfect. And in that perfection, he'd felt something fragile crack inside him. As she poured coffee, he studied the gentle curve of her back, wondering how much of his love was real and how much was just the disguise of a man trying to feel human again. When she turned, her joy washed over him like sunlight, and he forced his reflection to meet hers. To her, the world had finally fallen into place. To him, it was beginning to slip apart. By midday, the news had spread. Her phone filled with messages, friends screaming in capital letters, photos of the ring, endless hearts and exclamation marks. Emma's laughter echoed through the small apartment, the sound of someone who believed the future had already arrived. Ryan sat beside her, his arm draped casually over the couch, his mind elsewhere. He could feel the press of every congratulatory word like static in his head. Somewhere behind the noise, a voice whispered the name he'd tried to forget, the one tethered to the night he'd buried beneath years of lies. He stared at her hand, at the thin silver band that now tied her life to his, and for a fleeting moment, he imagined the cold weight of a police badge in the dark. He blinked, smiled, and kissed her temple. A man playing his role to perfection. Evening brought celebration. Emma's mother arrived with flowers and a tearful smile, the house filling with laughter and clinking glasses. Ryan played the part perfectly. Polite, attentive, affectionate, the kind of man any mother would trust. Yet every toast, every question about wedding plans tightened a noose he'd woven years ago. Maggie's eyes lingered on him longer than most. She saw something she couldn't quite name. A quiet stiffness behind his charm, a hesitation in his gaze. When Emma left the room, Maggie reached across the table, her hand brushing his. "You'll take care of her," she said softly. Ryan smiled, but the sound of her words echoed like a promise he had no right to make. That night, after everyone had gone, the silence felt heavier than the laughter that came before. Emma curled against Ryan's chest, tracing patterns on his arm, whispering about honeymoons and vows. He listened, nodding, every heartbeat slower than the last. Outside, thunder rolled over the horizon, distant but deliberate, like something waking from sleep. He closed his eyes, and behind the warmth of her touch, he saw another night. Flashing lights, red and blue, a body, half buried in mud. He'd spent years pretending it hadn't happened, years convincing himself that love might be enough to wash away sin. But as the storm crept closer, he knew what the morning would bring. Every promise made tonight was already built on borrowed time. The morning after the storm felt deceptively calm. Sunlight returned to the town like nothing had changed, and Emma's laughter carried through the open windows as she arranged flowers in a glass vase. Ryan watched her, still half-shadowed by the restless night, his eyes tracing the way light fell across her skin. Every detail of normalcy felt sharpened. The smell of coffee, the hum of traffic outside, the weight of the ring on her hand. It was the life had always wanted, the one he thought might finally drown out the echoes of his past. But as the day wore on, that past pressed harder against the edges of his mind, bleeding through the cracks of his calm. When Emma called his name, he flinched, smiling too quickly. She didn't notice. She never couldn't have guessed that beneath that tender silence, guilt had already begun to stir like a storm beneath still water. Later that afternoon, they drove to the lake where they'd first met. The road wound through quiet pine forests, sunlight breaking in fractured beams across the windshield. Emma talked about the wedding, about colors, guests, and the future that felt so close she could taste it. Ryan kept his eyes on the road, nodding in rhythm with her joy. The laughter in her voice made his chest ache, a sound too pure to coexist with the truth he carried. When they reached the lake, the still water mirrored the sky in perfect silence. She ran barefoot through the sand, spinning in the breeze, her dress rippling like a banner of hope. Ryan stood back, watching her reflection distort in the ripples, and for a brief moment he imagined disappearing into that water, letting the truth sink with him. That evening they returned home, sunburned and tired, the car radio humming low. Emma fell asleep against his shoulder before they reached the city. Ryan kept driving, headlights carving tunnels through the dusk, his thoughts drifting to a face he hadn't seen in years. The one that haunted every dream. The guilt came like waves now, pulling him under each time he tried to breathe. He thought of the ring, of her smile, of everything she didn't know. By the time he parked outside the apartment, his hands trembled against the steering wheel. For a long moment he stayed there, watching her sleep, listening to the soft rhythm of her breath. He wanted to believe love could redeem him. But every lie he told had a pulse of its own, and it was starting to beat louder than his own heart. By Sunday morning, the world had turned quiet again. Emma made breakfast in her favorite robe, while Ryan sat at the kitchen table, staring at his phone. A message blinked at the top of the screen. One name, one line of text that turned his blood cold. "We need to talk. It's about what happened that night." He locked the screen before Emma turned around. She noticed the change in him, the stiffness in his shoulders, the distance behind his eyes, but she smiled anyway, pretending not to. She brought him a plate of pancakes shaped like hearts and kissed his cheek. He smiled back, the gesture mechanical. Somewhere deep inside, the memory of that night began to replay, a reel of flashes and screams, the weight of something irreversible. That night, rain returned. The air felt heavy, thick with something unsaid. Emma sat curled on the couch, sketching dress ideas in her notebook, humming softly to the rhythm of the storm outside. Ryan stood by the window, phone in hand, staring at the number he couldn't bring himself to call. The message had come from Mark, a voice from the past that refused to stay buried. He typed a reply, deleted it, then finally turned the phone face down on the sill. Emma looked up, her voice breaking the quiet. "You okay?" He nodded without turning around. She smiled faintly and went back to her sketches, unaware that the moment she looked away, his reflection in the glass seemed like a stranger's. Monday morning dawned in gray silence, the kind of light that drains the color out of everything. Emma woke to find Ryan already gone, the faint smell of his cologne lingering in the hallway. She smiled, assuming he'd gone early to work, unaware of the weight pressing against his conscience. At his desk, Ryan stared blankly at his computer screen, the hum of the office fading behind the sound of his pulse. He couldn't stop seeing the message, the name that refused to fade. Mark had known him before all of this, before Emma, before the version of himself he'd tried to build. When his phone buzzed again, he didn't need to read it. He already knew what it said. The walls around him felt too close, too bright, every breath scraping like confession. Somewhere, deep down, he knew that this lie, this perfect life, had reached its final morning. Mark waited for him outside the parking garage, leaning against a concrete pillar, cigarette smoldering between nervous fingers. When Ryan approached, neither spoke. The air was thick with unfinished sentences, with the heavy scent of rain still clinging to the city. We can't keep pretending it didn't happen, Mark finally said, his voice unsteady. Ryan's jaw tightened. He'd told himself for years that the past could stay buried, that if he built something good, maybe it would all just fade. But Mark's presence was proof that the dead don't stay quiet. Ryan told him to leave it alone, that it was over. Mark's reply was a whisper that cut through the space between them. It's never over. For a moment, they stood face to face. Two men tethered by a single night neither could forget. Emma found the ring box that afternoon while cleaning. It was lying open on the dresser, the velvet darkened by dust. She picked it up, smiling absently, until she noticed something she hadn't before. Inside, under the lining, was a tiny scratch of metal, almost invisible, but deliberate. She lifted the fabric carefully and found a number etched faintly beneath. 6 digits that meant nothing to her, but felt like something more than coincidence. When Ryan came home later, she asked where he'd bought the ring. His answer came too fast, too smooth, rehearsed. For the first time, she felt a ripple of doubt. The man who'd knelt before her Friday night suddenly seemed like a stranger wearing his face. Dinner that night was silent. The clatter of cutlery filled the air where laughter used to live. Emma tried to start small talk. The weather, her students' plans for the weekend, but Ryan barely responded. Every time he looked at her, he saw the reflection of everything he'd stolen. The ring on her hand gleamed in the candlelight like an accusation. When she asked again where he'd gone that morning, his jaw tight. Work, he said too quickly. The lie hung between them, delicate as glass. She smiled faintly, but her eyes didn't match. Outside, rain began again, tapping against the windows like a metronome counting down to something inevitable. That night, Ryan sat alone in the dark. The rain outside had turned to a steady hiss, a sound that reminded him of the river, of that night, of the body, of the promise he never kept. He could feel the truth pressing harder now, an ache in his chest that refused to quiet. Emma slept in the next room, peaceful in her unknowing. He picked up the phone again, thumb hovering over Mark's last message. This time he typed 3 words, "We need to talk." Then he deleted them. The screen went black, reflecting only his face, tired, hollow, unrecognizable. For the first time, he didn't see a man in love. He saw a man already condemned. Tuesday morning began with silence thick enough to suffocate. Ryan didn't sleep. He sat through the night, watching dawn crawl up the walls. When Emma stirred, he pretended to be half awake, smiling the way he always did. But she saw something different now. Something hollow behind his eyes that hadn't been there before. He kissed her forehead, said he'd be home early, and left without touching his coffee. She watched him go, uneasy, without knowing why. The apartment felt strange once he was gone, as if his absence carried its own shadow. She opened her notebook, trying to distract herself with wedding notes, but the pen wouldn't move. The silence he left behind wasn't empty anymore. It was alive. At the office, Ryan's world had shrunk to whispers and glances. Mark avoided him all morning, but by noon the tension snapped. They met in the stairwell, away from curious eyes. "You think she won't find out?" Mark hissed. "You think you can build a life on that?" Ryan's hand gripped the railing hard enough to turn his knuckles white. He wanted to scream, to silence everything, to erase the past with a single breath. "I'm not that man anymore," he said. But even as the words left his mouth, he didn't believe them. Mark's expression softened. Pity, fear, something like regret. "Then tell her," he said, "before someone else does." The echo of those words followed Ryan all the way down the stairs. Emma stopped by Ryan's office that afternoon, carrying lunch wrapped in brown paper and a smile meant to heal whatever had gone wrong. But the receptionist looked surprised to see her. Said Ryan had left hours ago. Emma froze, the paper bag growing damp in her hands. Outside, the rain had started again, thin and relentless. She wandered to the parking lot, her breath misting against the chill, scanning for his car. It was gone. She told herself not to worry, that he was running errands, that everything was fine. But her voice in her head no longer sounded like her own. Ryan found himself parked outside the old industrial district, the kind of place time forgot. Abandoned warehouses, rusted fences, silence that hummed. He hadn't been back here since that night. The memories came flooding like a tide too heavy to fight. The shouting, the panic, the shove, the splash. He gripped the steering wheel, every muscle locked, sweat cold against his temples. The past was no longer behind him. It was waiting, patient and unblinking. He got out of the car, stepping into puddles that mirrored his reflection. Fractured, ghostly, unrecognizable. Somewhere nearby, a crow called, and for the first time in years, he whispered the name he'd buried. The sound of it hung in the air, heavy and unforgiving. When Ryan returned home, night had already fallen. Emma was waiting on the couch, eyes red, the uneaten dinner still on the table. "Where were you?" she asked quietly. He hesitated, then sat beside her, running a hand through his hair. "I just needed to think," he said. The words felt too small for the truth behind them. She studied him, the way his hands shook, the way his voice broke slightly on her name. "You're scaring me," she whispered. He looked up, and for the briefest second, something in him fractured. "You should be," he said softly, almost too quiet to hear. And in that single breath, she understood. Whatever darkness lived in him wasn't gone. It had just been waiting for its turn to speak. Monday arrived heavy with rain, a steady percussion that seemed to echo the inevitability of what was coming. Ryan hadn't slept. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the engagement ring glinting faintly on Emma's nightstand. She stirred but didn't wake, her breathing calm, her face unmarked by the storm in his chest. The decision had already been made. Though he hadn't yet said the words aloud, he knew what he had to do. Guilt had gnawed through every layer of his life, leaving only truth beneath. The world outside blurred through the window, all gray and washed clean, as if it too waited for a confession. He rose quietly, buttoned his shirt, and slipped the car keys into his pocket. Before leaving, he looked back one last time, memorizing her silhouette in the half-light. It was the image he would carry with him. The last moment before everything shattered. The police station sat at the edge of town, squat and gray against the storm. Ryan parked a block away, engine running, hands trembling on the wheel. He could hear the whisper of the past louder now, every sound from that night returning in brutal clarity. He stepped out into the rain, the cold biting through his coat, and crossed the street without an umbrella. Inside, fluorescent light swallowed him whole. The clerk at the front desk looked up, eyes weary but polite. "Can I help you?" she asked. Ryan hesitated, his throat dry, the air heavy in his lungs. "Yes," he said finally, his voice low but steady. "I need to report a murder." The words didn't echo. They landed quietly, like something that had been waiting years to be spoken. Detective Laura Finch met him in a small, windowless room that smelled faintly of bleach and paper. She'd seen every kind of confession before. The broken, the bitter, the desperate. But this one was different. Ryan looked calm, almost eerily so, as if relief had replaced fear. "You understand you have the right to remain silent?" she asked. He nodded, his eyes distant. "I've been silent long enough." The tape recorder clicked on, filling the room with mechanical stillness. "Tell me what happened," she said. Ryan took a breath that trembled through the air. "It was an accident," he began, but his voice broke before the second word. The truth came slow, heavy, every syllable scrapping against years of denial. By the time he looked up again, there was no version of himself left to hide behind. As the confession unfolded, the story spilled out in jagged pieces. A fight by the river, an argument gone wrong, a push that ended in silence. Mark had been there. They'd both panicked, both ran. Only one of them could bear the guilt long enough to survive. Laura listened without interrupting, her pen unmoving, her eyes fixed on his. The rain outside grew louder, blurring against the soundproof glass. "Why now?" she asked. Ryan exhaled, his voice no longer steady. "Because I asked her to marry me," he said softly. "And she said yes." The words lingered in the air, suspended between redemption and damnation. Laura nodded once, slow and deliberate, understanding more than he'd said. "Love has a way of showing us who we really are," she replied. Back home, Emma's world began to fracture. The call came that afternoon, a polite, measured voice asking her to come to the station. She arrived still wearing her engagement ring, her hands shaking as she handed her ID to the officer. When she saw Ryan through the glass, sitting alone under the white light, she couldn't breathe. The man she loved looked like a stranger carved from regret. Their eyes met for a single moment, and in that silence she understood everything. The proposal, the distance, the sleepless nights, all of it was built on a truth he'd tried too long to bury. The ring on her finger suddenly felt heavier than iron. She turned and walked away, her reflection fragmenting across the rain-streaked glass, leaving him to face the silence he'd finally earned. The morning after his confession, the town awoke to whispers. Word spread faster than truth ever could. Headlines painted Ryan as the perfect man who'd snapped, the loving fiancé turned killer. Detective Finch watched it unfold from her office, the case file open before her, rain tapping against the glass like an uninvited reminder. She had seen monsters before, but Ryan didn't fit that shape. He wasn't cold or cruel, just broken in a way that made her uneasy. There were gaps in his story, fractures where fear and memory blurred together. And then there was Mark. His name appeared in the report like an echo waiting to be answered. Laura closed the file, grabbed her coat, and stepped into the storm. The confession was only the beginning, and she could feel the truth was still out there, half buried in the mud where it had started. Detective Finch found Mark at a bar on the edge of town. A dim, smoke-stained place where forgotten men went to drink their guilt quiet. He didn't look surprised to see her, just tired. "You were there," she said, taking the stool beside him. He nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the amber swirl in his glass. "We didn't mean for it to happen," he muttered. He pushed him, but it wasn't like that. Laura leaned in, her voice steady. "Then what was it like?" Mark's jaw tightened, the tremor in his hand betraying him. "It was a fight, and when it was over we both walked away, but only one of us came back." The words hung in the stale air like smoke that wouldn't clear. That night, Laura drove to the old industrial district Ryan had mentioned. The rain had turned the ground to slick mud, the kind that swallowed footprints whole. Police tape still fluttered where the original search had ended years ago. Brittle, faded yellow, hanging like a ghost. She followed the path along the riverbank, flashlight cutting through the fog. The report said the body had never been found, only fragments. A shoe, a torn jacket, a stain in the dirt. But something about Ryan's story didn't match. He'd confessed to the act, but not to the reason. Her light caught on something glinting near the water. A piece of rusted metal, half buried, etched with the same 6 digits Emma had found inside the ring box. Suddenly, the story shifted. Back at the station, Finch spread the evidence across her desk. Photos, transcripts, fragments of truth that didn't quite fit together. The number etched in the metal matched the serial of a missing security badge belonging to a man named Derek Shaw. A factory foreman reported missing 8 years ago. The same night, Ryan claimed he'd made a mistake by the river. She replayed the confession again, listening for what wasn't said. His voice wavered on certain words, not guilt, but fear. He hadn't been hiding from what he'd done. He'd been protecting someone else, and with every new thread she pulled, one name kept resurfacing in the margins of witness reports: Mark Ellis. When Finch confronted Mark the next morning, he was already gone. His apartment was stripped bare, drawers emptied, phone left behind, curtains fluttering from an open window. It was the kind of exit made by someone who knew time had run out. Outside, the first light of dawn broke over the skyline, pale and indifferent. Finch stood in the doorway, the sound of sirens echoing somewhere distant. The truth had shifted again, the story unraveling faster than she could hold it together. Ryan's confession was no longer the end. It was the key to a deeper crime, one that had waited years for light. And now, as she looked out across the waking city, she knew she wasn't chasing guilt anymore. She was chasing survival. The rain had stopped by the time Emma stepped outside. The town felt different now, quieter, stripped of the warmth it once held. She hadn't been to the station since that day, hadn't heard Ryan's voice since he'd confessed, but the silence that followed spoke louder than anything he could have said. Every news broadcast, every headline, carved her life into something unrecognizable. Strangers spoke his name with venom. Friends avoided hers out of pity. She walked to the park they'd once loved, the one with the willow trees leaning over the pond, and sat on the same bench where he'd first told her he loved her. The air smelled like wet earth and endings. She removed the ring, holding it between her fingers. For the first time, she realized it wasn't a symbol of love at all. It was evidence of how well he'd hidden his truth. And as the last light faded, she let it fall into the water. Detective Finch stood behind the observation glass, watching Ryan as he waited for transfer to the county jail. He looked smaller now, the edges of his confidence worn down by truth. The camera on the wall blinked red, recording everything. His stillness, his regret, his silence. She'd seen countless suspects try to justify their sins, but Ryan didn't. He just sat there, eyes fixed on the floor, the hum of the overhead light filling the room. "We found Mark's car," she said through the intercom. He didn't look up. "By the river," she added. His eyes flickered, 1 second of pain breaking through resignation. She almost pitied him then. Almost. Because whatever the truth had been between those men, one thing was certain. The past doesn't drown quiet. Days passed. The story faded from the headlines, replaced by newer tragedies. But for Emma, it lingered, in the glances of strangers, in the empty half of the bed, in the quiet moments when she forgot and reached for someone who wasn't there. She visited her mother one evening, the house smelling of tea and rain. Maggie didn't ask questions. She simply held her daughter until the shaking stopped. "You couldn't have known," she whispered. But Emma wasn't sure that was true. Looking back, she remembered every strange silence, every pause before his smile. Every night he stayed awake, long after she'd fallen asleep. Love, she realized, hadn't blinded her. It had only made her see what she wanted. Detective Finch filed her final report 3 weeks later. Mark's body was never found, only his car and the muddy outline of footprints leading into the river. Officially, the case was closed. Unofficially, she knew there were still pieces missing. Truths that would remain underwater, too heavy to surface. She looked through the window of her office at the gray skyline, the city moving on without hesitation. Cases ended, people forgot, but guilt never really left. It only changed hands. Finch closed the file and exhaled, her reflection merging with the storm clouds outside. Some stories don't end with justice or redemption. Some just end with silence and the sound of rain returning after a brief pause. The town eventually forgot his name, but the story never really died. Somewhere between rumor and memory, it lingered, a warning whispered between lovers about the faces we trust too easily. Years later, the ring was found at the bottom of the pond, dulled by time but still intact. A boy fishing on a summer morning pulled it from the mud, holding it up to the light. It glimmered faintly, like something sacred and broken all at once. No one knew whose it was anymore, or the promises it once carried. In the end, that was all that remained of them. A circle of metal, a hollow symbol of love and guilt, waiting in silence to be found again.